Oh, okay, yeah. Well, welcome to the second of the Knapp Foundation Seminars of the Fellows. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor John Marenbon, who is a Senior Research Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, a Fellow of the British Academy, and of course, he is a Distinguished Research Fellow of the Knapp Foundation. His primary research interests lie in the field of philosophy in the long Middle Ages, originally concentrated especially on the earlier medieval Latin world, but more recently ranging more widely across the spectrum of medieval philosophy. He is presently working on language and truth in early medieval philosophy, some topics in medieval metaphysics, as well as philosophy in later medieval Europe outside the universities in terms of philosophy as a way of life. Furthermore, John has written throughout his career short policy studies for think tanks on matters at the interface between conservative philosophy and political policy, including, most recently, EDI Destroys British Universities, How to Restore Academic Freedom and Values for Politeia in 2024. Professor Marenbon's publications in all of these areas are vast in every sense of the word, so I will limit myself to only mentioning his wonderful 2015 book, Pagans and Philosophers, The Problem of Paganism from Augustine to Leibniz, and of course he was the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Medieval Philosophy, published in 2012. Today, John will be discussing conservatism and political philosophy, so over to you, John.
Good. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and of course, thank the Knapp Foundation and you and Lawrence for the invitation to do this talk. The announced aim of these talks is to enable fellows of the Knapp Foundation to give an idea of their current research. If I were to do that, I'd spend the next half hour talking about how people compared and analysed cultures in the Middle Ages, because that's actually my project just at the moment, discussing Al-Biruni and Roger Bacon, Ramon Lull, Maimonides, Ibn Khaldun, and many others. My present project in a lifetime's work on medieval philosophy. But I owe to the Knapp Foundation, especially to its director, Lawrence Hemming, and to Aaron Turner, who's taken on much of the hard work of organisation, that this afternoon I shall be talking about something entirely different, although not, as the last part of my talk will argue, without an important link. Because the Knapp Foundation has given me the chance to develop my work in conservative political philosophy. This is a new venture, since I've never before tried to contribute to academic political philosophy, and yet it isn't an altogether new departure for me, as indeed Aaron has anticipated. Because for 40 years now, as a sideline, I've been writing from a conservative perspective about political policy, especially concerning the universities and education more generally. Often I've been arguing at a level of generality that has meant my engaging with the positions proposed by political philosophers. My last big venture of this kind was to write about academic freedom. Academic freedom, along more generally with freedom of speech, has become a favoured cause for people who think of themselves as conservatives. I tried to argue, though, that what's primarily important for academic life is the cultivation of academic virtues, such as truthfulness, respect for tradition, and unworldliness. A cultivation which requires freedom in some ways, but in other ways constrains it. I found, though, that freedom so dominates thinking in conservative circles that my arguments had no traction. Indeed, the general reaction was simply to pretend that, because I was attacking its enemies, I had produced a straightforward defence of academic freedom. The fault was mine. I was trying to tackle a particular area, intellectual life in the universities, at a semi-popular level and in close connection with political developments, but I wasn't looking at fundamental principles. I was deploring the way in which conservatives had allowed their thinking to be taken over by ideas that, arguably, as conservatives, they should reject. Yet I hadn't addressed the basic question of how this conservative thinking should be justified, or whether, contrary to my views, there were good reasons for conservatives to adopt liberal ideas. I realised that work at a much more fundamental level is needed, philosophical work, and that is what the Knapp Foundation is helping me to do. Under its aegis, an online conference on freedom in conservative philosophy was held last June. I had the chance to give a paper, to reply to responses to it, and then to listen to and discuss a variety of other papers. The project continues this academic year with a series of online seminars beginning on November the 21st. In today's talk, I want to outline what I argued in June, what I learned from the responses and other papers, and then how my thinking has developed. I realized that by giving in this way a report on my own thinking, I may seem to be more interested in myself than my subject. But I am, I stress, a beginner in the area. I'm trying to find my way and looking to others for help. And you will be able to help me best if I show you the meandering journey to where I am now, which is still far from my destination. I began then in that paper by giving two reasons why a project to explore and discuss conservative political philosophy is needed. First, the positions in political philosophy discussed in universities usually either assume a liberal starting point or some variety of socialist or Marxist one. Conservative philosophy hardly exists in academia. Secondly, as I've already commented today, conservatives with both a small and a large c tend to adopt liberal arguments when they have to justify or argue about their positions. Indeed, political theorizing altogether seems to revolve around just two values, freedom and equality. Those on the right give greater weight to freedom, those on the left to equality, and some would say that without equality there's no real freedom. But freedom and equality are both distinctively liberal values. Conservatives in public life will often gesture to other values, the stability of families, preservation of tradition, patriotism, but when they are asked to justify themselves, they speak in the tongue of liberals. That was my starting point. Perhaps, though, I continued, the lack of conservative political philosophy is justified, as is the resort of conservatives to liberal arguments, because there are two fundamental objections to the whole concept of conservative political philosophy, the pragmatism objection and neutrality objection. Pragmatism objection is that conservatism as a way of thought and life exhibits an unreflective pragmatism. It isn't merely non-theoretical, but anti-theoretical, insisting on the limitations of reason and the value of customs, accepted beliefs, and even prejudice. A discourse that is genuinely conservative will be, by its very nature, unphilosophical. The neutrality objection is that philosophers should weigh up positions and the arguments for them dispassionately, whereas if they are to be conservative political philosophers, they must be parti pris. Liberals and Marxists, by contrast, can escape this objection. Liberals can say that they've come to their views because they've found that they were supported by the best arguments. Marxists because they read Marx and are convinced by what he wrote. The contrast shows how the two objections are closely connected. Conservatism, by its nature, cannot have the sort of broad arguments from first principles that there are for liberalism, both in general and for its particular species, or for Marxism. In particular, liberals, and ultimately Marxists too, can rely for their foundations on Kantian arguments about rational individuals and their autonomy under the rule of the moral law as members of a kingdom of ends. These are serious objections, and I proposed meeting them by a concession about the very nature of my enterprise. Conservative political philosophy, I argued, should be philosophy of conservatism, rather as there is a philosophy of quantum physics or of romanticism. It should use the conservative way of thinking, feeling, and acting as its raw material. In this way, it acknowledges that conservatism, its material, is not itself a philosophical position, but that doesn't prevent there from being genuine philosophical speculation about it. The pragmatism objection is therefore met. And that speculation need not be parti pris. Just as a philosopher of romanticism might in fact hate romantic art and ways of thought, the philosopher of conservatism need not share conservative values. And so the neutrality objection is answered. I went on to argue that an advantage of this approach is that conservative political philosophers could start from the bottom up, as it were, and could leave aside overarching questions of ethics and metaphysics, thereby achieving an epistemic humility appropriate when proposing arguments, when proposing arrangements for whole societies. I developed this anti-metaphysical stance in the second part of my paper when I discussed the theme of the conference, freedom. I distinguished three levels of freedom: metaphysical, so discussions about determinism, compatibilism, so on; moral, as in Kant; and everyday, as we place value on free speech, freedom from burdens and regulation, freedom of family life, academic freedom, freedom to keep property and earnings and bequeath them. I suggested that only this final level has a place in conservative philosophy, but that these freedoms are better conceptualized not as freedoms from constraint, but positively in terms of the virtues intrinsic to the activities concerned. So, for instance, in the case of family life, the focus should be not what states should be prevented from doing to families, but the duties of the family and its benefits, and the inalienable role of the family in any well-knit social fabric. I shan't try to summarize the final section of my June talk, because it was mixed up, and I think I can now say better what I was trying to do there, and I'll try to do that very shortly. But I want to mention one point I made at the end, that we shouldn't think of conservatism as something that began at the end of the 18th century as a reaction to liberalism, and in particular the French Revolution. It is far older and more widespread. I mention that specially because I now want to allude to what I learned from the rest of the conference, and this was one of the 2 points in my talk picked up by others in the conference and rejected by everybody. Tom Pink, one of my respondents, rejected it explicitly, and other speakers, looking at the subject from a more historical angle, rejected it implicitly by sticking to the familiar narrative with Burke at its beginning. Tom Pink also argued convincingly that one cannot, as I tried to do, isolate treatment of freedom on the third everyday level from first-level metaphysical questions about how we analyze acting freely. Indeed, and I think that he was quite right, and as I shall go on to say, my whole attempt to do political philosophy without metaphysics, I think, was thoroughly misguided. However, I don't want to give up the point that the first point that I made, that's to say that we shouldn't think of conservative philosophy as something narrowly limited to the tradition from Burke, and I'll come on to that again. There were many excellent papers given in the rest of the conference, and I want to mention 2 in particular, one immediately, which is the discussion by Tom Anjay, where he argued that in order to thrive, political communities need to put virtues rather than freedom, as he put it, at their heart. And he developed this theme, drawing not just on Aristotelian virtue ethics, but on the treatments of virtues in African thought. The other paper I'll come to in a few moments, because let me ask now, what have I learned from the responses made to my paper, from the other papers, and also from my own reflections and second thoughts? The central proposal of my paper, that conservative philosophy should be philosophy of conservatism, was not explicitly criticized, but I think both my commentators, Tom Pink and Lawrence Hemming, implicitly rejected it, and they were right to do so. I've come to think that the proposal cannot work for the simple reason that conservatism, with a small c, is not a political position in a vague, muddled, unthought form from which, with philosophical analysis, a fully fledged political philosophy will emerge. Conservatism is something much wider and deeper than much wider and deeper than a political position. It's a way of thinking and being. There can be a good or bad fit between it and political positions, but not even inchoately the sort of detail that would allow a distinct political philosophy to emerge from it. Rather than wanting conservative philosophy to be a philosophy of conservatism, I should be in search of a political philosophy for conservatism, or rather for conservatives, A political philosophy that can fully justify itself, so far as any can, at all levels, including the metaphysical and ethical, and so meets both the pragmatism and the neutrality objections, and which is in harmony with the conservative way of life, where there is a good fit. Now, maybe there is no such political philosophy. Maybe conservatism as a way of life is not merely anti-philosophical in its pragmatism, but anti-philosophical to such an extent that it's not just a matter of no philosophy emerging from it, but no philosophy even being compatible with it. I don't accept this view, but it needs to be shown to be wrong. To do so, we must find or devise a political philosophy for conservatives, one which has a good fit with conservatism. But how should we do so? The most straightforward way, I'll call it the first path, would be to engage in political philosophy as it's done now in the universities, accepting the basically Kantian perspective, but adjusting it to accommodate conservative ways of thought and being. The fundamental liberal emphasis on individual freedom for all is retained, but importance is given also to units beyond the individual: families, associations, cities, nations. Against the cosmopolitanism assumed by many liberal theorists is pitched the many obvious gains for individuals of belonging to and feeling loyalty to a particular larger whole, distinct from others, such as a nation. And there are indeed a few political philosophers who are working along these lines. And to come to the second of the conference papers, to which I alluded a few moments ago, it's the one by John Skorupski, in which he explained why Hegel would be a good philosopher for conservatives who are thinking conservatives to follow. And I'd suggest that in effect that would be a sophisticated, if in some ways idiosyncratic way of taking this first path. But in whatever way this first path is followed, there will always be a lack of fit with conservatism, an underlying split to bridge which a whole bevy of considerations is imported, but yet the split will still be there. I've said that conservative philosophy is all but absent from universities, but not totally absent, therefore. It's absent from most political philosophy courses, but there is a tradition of conservative philosophy, which is inevitably traced back to Burke, and which has a few contemporary academic exponents, of whom the outstanding is the late Roger Scruton. Scruton surely cannot be accused of being a liberal in conservative dress. Does not he, and do not others who belong to this tradition, offer a different and better second path to a political philosophy for conservatives? But is the second path really so different from the first? Most of Scruton's most famous book about conservatism, The Meaning of Conservatism, is what he called dogmatics, a description of conservatism rather than political theory. But the appendix is an avowedly philosophical discussion of Kant's idea of the autonomous subject. Scruton argues powerfully that the first personal view Kant takes, which is characteristic of liberalism, separates us from real existence in the world, the third personal view that conservatives would take. Scruton goes on to say that in order to abandon liberalism entirely, we would need to abandon this first personal point of view, but that is, I quote, something that it is neither possible nor desirable to do. It's not surprising then to find Scruton in a later book representing conservatism as a reaction to Kantian liberalism, but also a continuation and development of it, taking up some ideas, modifying them, and adding others, much the same as the first path then. There is, though, a third path, and it's here that my day job as an historian of philosophy becomes relevant. There are two ways in which what I call a real history of philosophy can especially help philosophizing now. A real history of philosophy is one that does not restrict itself to a canon and, using a broad definition, seeks out philosophy wherever it was done, rather than restricting itself to those philosophers of the past useful for showing, supposedly, how we reached where we are now. Such a real history offers those philosophizing now a vast array of positions and arguments, not just particular themes, but manners of approach. It is one of the greatest deficiencies of contemporary philosophy that it neglects this rich material. A real history of philosophy is also genuinely historical. It shows philosophers producing their ideas under particular circumstances, under many restrictions, for all sorts of reasons, many non-philosophical. This should act as a therapy to stop us taking for granted the way philosophy has developed. We are free to go back in our thinking to explore some avenue that was hinted at but never pursued, or some way of thinking that was subsequently dismissed as outdated by a change in philosophical fashion. This is what I suggest we should do as a third path to making a philosophy for conservatism. Pacey scrutiny, it is both desirable and possible to do without the first-person view adopted by Kant, a way of philosophizing that many would trace back to Descartes, although that is simply a much more complicated story. But we can, as I say, turn our backs on this and do without this, and look to the broad Western tradition, to Aristotle and his inheritance, not just in the Latin, but in the Greek, Arabic, and Jewish traditions, look to them to provide us with a starting point for our political philosophy for conservatives, and look especially, but not exclusively, to the virtue ethics you found there. And you can see why, therefore, I found Tom Angier's paper so stimulating, and why I look forward to hearing about his present work, which involves taking Aristotelian virtue theory into political philosophy. And I also welcome his suggestion that we can use non-Western traditions too. They will enrich the material and strengthen the freedom of manoeuvre made available by a sufficiently broad approach to the broad Western tradition. You may now have the impression that this third path has nothing to do with what I put forward in June, but that would be wrong. I haven't changed my mind completely, though I've changed my mind on some important points. So, for example, when I was talking about what I then thought of as the philosophy of conservatism, I said that it would be engaged in trying to understand themes important to conservatives, which are almost always neglected by political philosophers, in favour of the two topics that dominate their discussions, freedom and equality. Among such themes, I mentioned virtues in their relation to particular practices and institutions, some political social groups, localities, institutions, families, tradition, culture, nationhood and history, hierarchy, nobility, and fashion. Discussing topics such as these is also central to my third path, as now proposed, for providing a philosophy for conservatism, as is the replacement of thinking about freedoms from constraint by consideration of the virtues intrinsic to the activities concerned. Much in the programme of work remains the same then, but the link between conservatism and the philosophy that I'm trying to produce is less exclusive. It should be a political philosophy for conservatives, but it need not be only for conservatives or for conservatives alone. And, most importantly, so far from trying to prescind from wider questions of metaphysics, philosophical psychology and ethics, I recognize that if we were to follow the third path, and even if we're to understand what sort of an itinerary it offers, they must be faced and, with the help of the long and varied traditions of philosophy, answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was an excellent paper, and we have some time for questions. I knew Lawrence's time would go straight up. I'm going to jump in first because he never asks short questions. And I'm just going to ask about this third path in terms of when we were preparing for that conference in June, we looked at Patrick Deneen's book and we looked at Yoram Hazany's book, and both of them shared an idea that concerning the history of philosophy and possibly going back and cherry picking the best conservative ideas and philosophies from history to implement into a new conservative philosophy. So I wonder, in terms of this undertaking, this third path, to what extent do you ignore then the circumstances which led to those ideas not being taken up? Like, you mentioned they might be outdated or weren't accepted at the time. So to what extent does a real history of political philosophy in terms of conservative thought take into account why those ideas weren't taken up initially in the first place?
Well, yes, I think, real history of philosophy should certainly be very open or sensitive to or deal with exactly those sorts of questions. So part of the thing is that one is not just restricting oneself to looking at the particular philosophers and explaining what they thought, but also trying to consider the whole context in which they thought it. And in part of that is just what happens to the ideas, how people respond, how long they go on being used, and so on. All that is very important. But I think that leads, I think your suggestion is, we'll then know, we'll sort of see why it became old-fashioned, and so we'll then say, yes, it was right to reject it. But I think that rather what one sees, perhaps that could happen, but I think that what one tends to see is what one might call the contingency of what happens. It's, there are some ideas or arguments that are very bad and don't survive for that reason. It's very weak and people people don't follow them. But so often why this position gets taken and taken on and that doesn't depends on, and you see all sorts of different factors which are not to do with the strength of the argument. And so I suggest that it's precisely that attention to the whole context, including the reasons why arguments get dropped and why fashions change, that in a sense liberates one. Instead of feeling, well, I've just got to follow the canon which exists, you rather think that you can choose much more freely.
Thank you. Lawrence.
John, thank you so much. There's so much in your paper I'd like to discuss. I don't know where to begin. I'm going to leave Hegel out of it. My personal view is that Hegel is the father of liberalism, and it's impossible to derive a conservative understanding of the world from Hegel, despite himself, oddly enough. But the question I wanted to ask you really relates. How best to put this? My own problem with liberalism is not its understanding of the individual, but rather I've always understood liberalism as a theory of the state and the individual's relation to the state. And the problem with that is that and that's, by the way, exactly how Hegel saw it as well. He understood this both through Fichte and Rousseau. And Hegel's fear in trying himself to be anti-liberal was that the state would always end up in a tyranny, in a tyrannous relationship with at least some, if not the majority, of the people who lived within it. And this begs a deeper question, a question that it seems to me that any serious conservative philosophy has to address. And that is democracy itself part of the fundamental destiny of the West? I mean, and I pose it in that way because democracy arises as a Western phenomenon. I don't pose it by saying that it is in any sense superior or that the West has all the answers, but rather this is something that belongs to the Western reflection on political philosophy. And that a genuine conservative philosophy is one which safeguards the possibility of democracy against its tendencies towards tyranny. The examples that, if I had the time, but I haven't because I want to hear you rather than simply speak, but would be to draw on the reforms of Cleisthenes and on the reforms of Solon in defending a democracy, but also draw attention to the Greek taboos against, let's say, what we could now call party politics. That, for instance, there could be no parties within the polis, precisely to allow what Count von York called the free circulation of political opinion, where you had to go and fight for your opinion in the agora. No, it was possible to do this in a democracy as small as the Athenian democracy, for instance. But nevertheless, it does strike me that a conservative philosophy has to do two things. One, it has to show that it is genuinely rooted in a historical time and place, which is something you strongly alluded to. But secondly, that it deals with something which is also rooted in the life experience of the peoples of that time and place, which would be democracy, except that the real periods of democracy, if one were to point to them, have actually been across the whole history of the West relatively short. But it strikes me that those are the things that a genuine conservative philosophy has to tackle. And slightly tongue-in-cheek, I want to tease you that I didn't hear you use the word democracy once, or any cognate of it. But I'd love to know what your response is.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I didn't use the word democracy, and I wasn't thinking about it primarily. And I suppose I wouldn't give it the primary position that you do, because it seems, and I mean, if I'm considering things in terms of, if you like, what is produced and the fit with conservatism, democracy would be a sort of means to an end rather than an end. Democracy, certain sorts of well-working democracies can produce the sort of results that conservatives want. So democracies, for instance, can bring about stability. They can bring about the chance for lots of different institutions at different levels to flourish. They can be conducive to the developments of all sorts of virtues in different types of activities. So it's and I think that I think in developing the details of the political philosophy that fits well for conservatism for today, one would certainly want to be developing them in terms of democracy. And I think that's very important. And so I think that I think it's perhaps right, or you're right to say that there was an important omission, even in my sketching out things broadly and not mentioning democracy, because I think you probably need to do it in those terms. But it's not. I mean, I can see in principle that you could have political philosophies sorts of political philosophy that would be good for conservatives in other times. Possibly, I don't know about this, even in other cultures in which democracy didn't have that position. And I mean, I wonder if you place democracy quite so centrally, because you're thinking very much in terms of, on the one hand, ancient Greece, and then more modern Europe. Whereas if one's thinking, as I tend to do in terms of a long, I suppose, a broadly Western tradition, but no, stretching right back to ancient Greece, but then rather sort of continuously onto our days, there are so many places and periods where you have nothing like democratic rule. But no, I wouldn't want to say sort of thereby these are ways of things being that a conservative political philosophy should condemn, though I don't think I don't think that's how we would want to go about things now. I think we would want to go about them sort of via democracy.
Could I press you just a little, on that? Because I've just been reading Victor Davis Hanson, and he writes very well about this, about the failure of the democratic impulse. He writes especially about the United States, but a lot of the arguments that he uses in his recent book, The Good Citizen, I think it's called The Good Citizen, are also true here. The way in which, for instance, democratic power has been transferred away from democratically elected bodies into the hands of regulators and bureaucrats and so forth. But also you have the ideas of someone like John Donne, who says that we shouldn't even speak of modern forms that we call democratic, because they're not really democratic. They are rather falsely democratic. But it strikes me, though, that inherent to the Greek idea is a conception of freedom, very different from the liberal understanding of freedom, very different from the Kantian understanding of freedom. The understanding of Kantianism and idealism is, where I set the law for myself, as it were, but I set the law for myself, which is always presumed to be compatible with the law for everybody else, but actually it fundamentally relies on an ethics. That's Nietzsche's point, isn't it? That if you haven't got a highest good lurking in the background, then when you have an idea of ideas, which doesn't turn out to be the good, as it were, all you have is a leading idea as a way of organizing social order. That's actually largely where we're ending up in many political debates at the present time. But the conservative comes back with the ballast of history and says, actually, you don't need a metaphysical idea of the good as Plato devised it. All you need to show is that freedom is secured on the equality that democracy makes possible, because there is an equalization of exercise of power in that, which is a sufficient guarantee of its own. And wouldn't therefore, let's say, if we were to pursue a conservative philosophy, a good conservative philosophy to pursue would be, let's strive for the accomplishment of something like what the Greeks were trying to strive for in, for instance, the best documented democracy that we have, which is the Athenian democracy. As long as we've got a few people like Sophocles in the background to poke fun at the disasters that will inevitably happen as it unfolds. That's where I think I'd want to press you, that one can get your non-metaphysical, because I am curiously enough, as a student of Heidegger, as anti-metaphysical, I suspect, as you are, in the sense that purely rational constructs of political constitutions, in my opinion, don't work. But the unfolding of a genuine historical pointing towards, and that question pointing towards freedom, which is not a metaphysical concept, but a historical one, would give you everything you need. And it would, by virtue of having to make appeal to history, be a conservative philosophy. But that would be my suggestion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a very interesting suggestion. That's really working at the thing going at the thing in a completely different way, which might be right. As I said, I mean, I'm just trying to learn, and in a way, I mean, I have to take the two different points you've made in two different ways. So, I mean, one of the points would be that I need, within the framework in which I'm thinking, to think much more about democracy. But your second point is really saying, look, really tear off all you've done now so far, which is fine, and think about it in this way. And that's very interesting, and that might be the right way to do it. I mean, I'd love to hear a paper on that, but it's more an alternative suggestion to how to go about things than a point about one or another part of my paper or my ideas, because it's trying to reach the same objective, conservative political philosophy, but in a completely different way, and even with a rather different understanding of what conservative political philosophy would be. But I accept an equally defensible idea of it. So, in a sense, I need to think about it, but I can't reply in detail or fit it to what I was saying in detail, because it's so different.
And so, yeah, you've outed me for the radical that I am, and I apologize for not attending. I mean, I apologize. I didn't mean to tear up your paper, as it were, in favor of my own proposal. But yeah. But
we're both as radical as each other. We are out of time, so could we thank John again for his paper? And thank you, John.
Thank you very much for your questions.
And we will reconvene next week for I think it's Dave McGrogan. So thank you very much. See you next week. Bye.